Continuação da leitura do livro The New Map, estou no capítulo 10. A leitura está sendo em inglês, na língua original do material do livro. So, crisis over gas. Russia's supply of natural gas to Europe, about 35% of Europe's total gas consumption, is at the center of the geopolitical clash. It comes with a basic question. Is this reliance and multi-billion-dollar gas businesses as an instrument of Russian power and influence, or it is a part of a mutually beneficial, geographically determined trading relationship? And if both, where does the balance lie? Nowhere in this tension more evident than in the fissured and violent relationship between Russia and Ukraine. The consequences reverberate on energy markets in relations with Europe and on the relationship between Russia and the United States, with impacts ranging from the US military budget and the domestic strife over the 2016 US presidential election to the rising hostility between the world's two major nuclear power countries, to the impeachment trial of Donald Trump in 2020. Indeed, if one were to point to a single most important reason for the new antagonism between Russia and the West and the new Cold War, it is Ukraine and the bitter and unsettled questions resulting from the breakup of the Soviet Union and the way they have played out. The linguistic root of Ukraine means edge or borderland. The territory that became known as Ukraine is mostly as an extended plain with few natural borders. Ukraine and Russia both assert a common origin in Kievan Rus, and this medieval kingdom was established by Viking warriors who intermixed with local Slavic tribes in what became known as Rus lands, which were ruled from Kiev, the capital of Ukraine today, Kiev. And despite their shared lineage in Kiev Rus, modern Ukraine and Russia clash bitterly over claims of common identity, as Russians portray it, versus separate identities as Ukrainians assert. Kievan Rus disappeared from history when the Golden Horde of the Mongols sacked Kiev in 1240. The first maps of Ukraine, including its borders, were drawn around 1640, when it was part of the Grand Duchy that combined Lithuania and Poland. One map was labeled General Description of the Empty Plains, in common parlance Ukraine. 14 years later, in 1654, a leader of the Cossacks, in what today is Ukraine, swore allegiance to the Tsar of the Eastern Slavic Principality of Moscow, which was regathering the Russian lands. Historians, politicians, and nationalists continue to argue today whether that allegiance to Muscovy was conditional, retaining autonomy, or absolute submission and incorporation into the regathered lands. Nationalist identity and fervor were developing in Russia's Ukraine before World War I. This was at the same time the full-scale industrialization got underway in the Donbas region in southeastern Ukraine, drawing in Russian speakers from elsewhere in the empire. In 1918, shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, an independent Ukraine was declared, but it disappeared in the chaos of the Russian Civil War. After the Bolshevik victory, Ukraine became a founding republic of the Soviet Union. With the breakup of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, Ukraine was for the first time, aside from that fleeting moment to the end of World War I, No longer an idea, a borderland, a province of an empire, no more. Now, for the first time, it was a sovereign nation. At independence, Ukraine was born nuclear, for it inherited 1900 nuclear warheads from the Soviet Union, making it the world's third largest nuclear state. In 1994, it was known as Budapest Memorandum. It gave those weapons and transferred them to Russia. In exchange, Russia, Britain, and the United States solemnly promised to respect the existing borders of Ukraine. One institution managed to sail through the maelstrom of the post-Soviet collapse intact, though somewhat battered the Ministry of Natural Gas. It, however, changed its name to Gazprom. It gained control of the big export pipelines and the revenues that came from exports, and thus inherited the Soviet-era relationship with the major Western European energy companies. Gazprom became the largest gas company in the world. It provided gas to keep Russia's domestic economy going. Even if bills went unpaid, it maintained its reputation as a reliable supplier to Western Europe. And it delivered desperately needed revenues to the national treasury. Amidst the chaos of the collapse, Gazprom represented not only continuity with the past but also Russia's future economic integration with the West. Gazprom insisted it operated as a commercial organization, but for some outside Russia, it was not just a gas company. It was also the palpable ghost of the Soviet-American Cold War, the embodiment of resurgent Russian power, and the instrument for Russia to gain leverage over Western Europe, and thus drive a wedge between Europe and the United States. At the heart of the gas issue was Ukraine. In which direction would Ukraine look for its future? This fundamental question was inflamed relations between Ukraine and Russia ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union. Would it continue to look east and remain under Moscow's sway, or west towards Europe and the European Union, and worse from Moscow's point of view towards NATO and the United States, OTAN? Natural gas and the pipelines that carry it had bound the two countries together, but now would set them again against each other. Gas imported from Russia was Ukraine's major energy source and critical to its own economy and fueling its heavy industry. Moreover, the tariffs, that is, the fees that Ukraine earned on the transmission of Russian gas to Europe through its pipelines and territory, were a major source of government revenue. But this was not a one-way street. Assuring access to Europe was critical for Gazprom, for the European market was its major source of revenues. That meant Russia also depended on Ukraine. As late as 2005, 80% of its gas exports to Europe passed through Ukraine pipelines. And that, of course, had not mattered when Ukraine and Russia were both parts of the same country, and were connected by what was called the Brotherhood gas pipeline. But now the Soviet Union was gone, and it mattered a lot. Ukraine and Russia were no longer brothers. The breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 quickly led to acrimony, like angry feelings between the two countries over the price of Russia's gas and the tariffs charged by Ukraine for passage through its pipelines. Yet the disputes were largely contained until the 2004 contested Ukrainian presidential election, in which the two victors were pitted against each other. The initial winner, in what was widely seen as a rigged, like to control in a dishonest way, a rigged election, was Viktor Yanukovych, the sitting prime minister and a one-time boxer. Yanukovych. Native language was Russian, and he was Moscow's candidate. His opponent was the other Viktor Yushchenko, a former prime minister and head of the central bank and a native Ukrainian speaker, for whom Europe was the great calling. The stolen election ignited massive protests, which converged on Kiev's Maidan Square in what became known as Orange Revolution, after the colors of Yushchenko's campaign. In a court-imposed runoff, Yushchenko won, and the result was a shock to Moscow. Ukraine now had a president who wanted to look west, as if to drive home that point. His wife was an American of Ukrainian descendants, a graduate of Georgetown University who has worked in the Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan. For the Kremlin, the outcome was a powerful warning of the existential threats from color revolutions, like an attempt to end a government's rule. Ukraine's Orange Revolution had been preceded by the Rose Revolution in newly independent Georgia, which had swept anti-Russian reformers to power. These color revolutions, as Moscow saw it, were supported by Western non-governmental organizations, and Moscow suspected by Western security services that were aiming to dislodge Russia from the privileged sphere in the rest of the former Soviet Union. Even worse, the Orange Revolution could potentially bring OTAN, like NATO, which the Baltic nations had already joined, the Ukraine's borders with Russia. That said, Putin would be a direct threat to Russian security, and there was the further risk that the contagion of color revolutions might spread to Red Square in Moscow. Yushchenko's victory triggered truculent negotiations over natural gas prices. Ukraine was paying only one-third or even less of what Western Europeans were paying. Why, said the Russians, should they continue to subsidize Ukraine with cheaper gas to the tune of billions of dollars a year, when Ukraine was already billions of dollars in arrears on its gas bill, and was now led by a president who wanted to pivot again away from Russia? Well, beyond the revenues, Moscow had another objective: to gain control over the all-important Ukrainian gas pipeline system, on which it depended for sending its gas to Europe. This, however, was not on the table, and Yushchenko put it those pipes laid down in Soviet times were the crown jewels of independent Ukraine. On January 1, 2006, with no resolution in sight, Gazprom cut off gas earmarked for Ukraine. But Ukrainians siphoned off gas meant for delivery to Europe, which cut gas supplies to other European countries and led to a crisis in Russia's relations with Europe. Russia maintained that the cutoff was not about politics, but simply about economics and market pricing. The Ukrainians should no longer get such a steep discount, but for Europe and the United States, the issue was Moscow's demonstration of raw energy power. Russia said U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was using natural gas and oil as a politically motivated weapon. The game just can't be played that way, she declared. After a few days, the two sides managed to come to a new agreement, but Russia did not get control over the Ukrainian pipeline system. Kiev would not give up the crown jewels. Left in place was a musky and mysterious company called Hose UK Energo that played a central role in the gas business. 3 years later, on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2008, Vladimir Putin sought to inject a little humor into his raw day remarks on Russian television. It's a sure sign New Year is coming, he said. The gas negotiations are heading up. Hours later, on January 1st, 2009, Russia once again cut off gas directly from Ukraine's own consumption. Putin declared that the gas destined for Europe was again being siphoned off and stolen by Ukrainians. He ordered a halt of the shipments on gas into Ukraine. That meant that now no gas was being put into the system for Europe. It took more than 2 weeks, and what Putin called difficult negotiations for Russia and Ukraine to come to a new deal. Yet, remarkably, despite exceptionally cold weather, this second gas crisis resulted in no shortages, except in parts of the Balkans. The Ukrainians had built up ample storage, and the Europeans also drew gas from storage. This crisis put a new emphasis on energy security for both Russia and Europe. But the concept of energy security meant striking different things to them. Bem, terminou o capítulo 10.